The genesis of this presentation really began about 2.5, 3 years ago when I got tired of listening to people talking about the Palestinians' claims that the land that Israel now occupies is really their historical land. And so I thought I would do some research, and it took me a while to delve into this and find the history. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this from a historical perspective, and what you'll come to the same conclusion I did is that the Palestinian claims to the land that Israel now occupies are actually myths. So again, why are we having this conversation? Well, the reality is it started with the formation or the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and the Israelis said to the Arabs living in the land that was given to them through the United Nations was, you have a choice. You can either stay, become a citizen, swear allegiance to the State of Israel, we will welcome you as citizens, or there's the front door, you can go. The Arab nations who were opposed to the partition of what's known as the partition of Palestine were opposed to this, and they basically said, come to us, we're going to push the Jews into the sea, and then we'll give you all the land back. Well, that didn't happen, obviously, and billions in money was given to the Palestinians, and they were put in camps, and very little of that money ever got to the camps. Most of it was taken by Palestinian leaders and other terrorist groups and went into their pockets. So the radicals in the Palestinian organization in the Arab world started using the camps as recruiting grounds for terrorists. And so now we have what you have today, which is PLO, Hamas, Fatah, Hezbollah, all these countries, all these organizations that are opposed to the continuance of the State of Israel as a nation. Now, understand that as the events in Gaza unfolded, and as the events in Syria unfolded, none of the Arab countries around there wanted to take any of the Palestinians as refugees. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I don't want to go into the history, but the fact of the matter is the Arabs don't want them, and so the Palestinians are stuck. And so when the money dried up, the problems in the camps got worse, and so now you have this volatile situation in Gaza and the PLO, in the West Bank around Israel. So with this in mind, I want to start with a bit of history and give you some context, and I'm going to actually do this in both the years that we traditionally use in the West, which is the year, as we're talking, in March 2025, but in reality, in the Jewish world, that's really the year of 5,785. So think about this for a second, that Judaism has been around for 5,785 years, and so a lot of this goes back to the days when Judaism started, okay? Christianity didn't start until 2,025 years ago, and the Muslim religion didn't start until about 660 to 670 AD. So it's, again, long after Judaism started as a religion. So what you're going to see in this presentation is I'm going to show not only before the Christian era as well as the AD years when appropriate to give you a perspective, and then compare them to the Jewish years, because that's the only consistent timeline you have. So again, from the initial days of Judaism in roughly 3,761 BC, and there's some debate as to whether it's 760, 759, 765, doesn't matter. It's close, it's 761 is close enough. But this is where most of the Jews lived in the world in that time. And if you notice, it's parts of modern day, I list the nations up here: Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, and a place called Judea. And this is one of the many maps that you can find about traditional Judea. This shows the different tribes, and this is Judea as we know it from both biblical or religious documents as well as archeological evidence. And so when you look at this, this is the land where the kings David and Solomon and Saul ruled. And they lived in the Judean hills and along the coast. And it's also where Abraham purchased the grave for Sarah, all this good stuff. And it's talked about in the Jewish Torah, which is the basis for a lot of other religious documents for other religions. So anyway, What's interesting is since this time, 5 empires literally have ruled this era. And you can see I list the Babylonians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Crusaders, and the Ottomans. The Ottomans are the only ones that could even be closely considered Arab. And in most cases, when you see the word Ottoman, you see the next word Turk. Why? Because the capital of the Ottoman Empire was Constantinople or Istanbul, depending on which title you want to use. But these are the periods of those empires. And so, like a lot of things in history, one country conquers an area, controls it for a while, somebody else pushes them out, and goes on and on. So we're going to go through that history. So after the Jews left Egypt, and they spent the traditional 40 years in Sinai, and they arrive in Canaan, or Canaan, depending on which way you want to pronounce it. So around 1134 B.C.E., which is the Jewish year 2617, Moses leads the Exodus. Now, before then, there was a monograph from a pharaoh which talks about the Jews or the Israelites as a nation, as a tribe, and so that's another documentation that they were there. And so they lead the Exodus, they move into or reconquer Canaan, or the land we would call Judea, and then in 722 BCE, the Assyrians arrive. Some people call them the Euclids. There's a whole bunch of different terms for them. But the point of the matter is the Assyrians take over or conquer Judea, and the first recorded diaspora begins. In other words, the diaspora is the rulers of the area of Israel or Judea forced the Jews to leave, some if not all. They never got all of us to leave, but again, there's evidence that the Assyrians were trying to force Jews to leave. Where'd they go? Well, they went down the Mediterranean littoral, both on the north and the south sides of it. There's a revolt against the Successives, however you pronounce it, and the Assyrians led by Judah Maccabees. That's the first recorded war for religious freedom. It lasts for God knows for many years. Ultimately, the Assyrians are defeated, and that leaves Judea there for a while, and then suddenly, guess who arrives? The Romans. So Pompey arrives, conquers Judea, and the Jews and the residents, actually not just Jews, were really unhappy. So there's a period of wars between 66 and 132 AD. In the beginning of all this, by the way, Christ is crucified in 33 AD. And the Romans get really, really annoyed with the local population, primarily the Jews. And then you have the second diaspora. Again, they dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, a lot, which meant along the North African coast into southern Europe. And then in 2004, the Roman Emperor Diocletian divides Judea into 3 areas. And this is the first time you see the words Palestinia. Now, it actually comes from Greek. And I use the traditional spellings here, but it divides them into 3 different sections, each with its own capital, but it's essentially Judea. Well, around 306 AD, the Roman Empire fractures into the Byzantine Empire, and the Roman Empire, what's left of it. And so now the Byzantine Empire is running the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and the Jewish population there was required to pay an annual tax. They couldn't run for public office, they couldn't own land, and oddly enough, they couldn't own slaves, which is really interesting because Judaism forbids people from owning slaves, and the Jews were not allowed to build new synagogues. And this is all driven primarily by the Eastern Orthodox Church, which again was the Byzantine Empire. So you fast forward a few hundred years, and this guy by the name of Mohammed is born. And what's really interesting is the date of birth is imprecise, but the date, again, due to the research I've done, is June 8th, 632 AD. Now, and he dies in Medina. What's interesting is that was a period of time where there's not a lot of written records, but we'll take that for whatever it is. Anyway, so Muhammad has a better idea. He decides to create his own religion, and he comes up with these ideas, and he tries to convert the Jews living in what's now Saudi Arabia, and primarily Mecca and Medina, and he was rejected. In fact, that rejection was so strong that he became very intolerant of those who did not agree to convert to Islam. And he creates an army and begins an army of conquest. I'll get to the army of conquest here in a second. What's really interesting is when he's writing the Quran, He liberally borrows from Jewish documents, Torah and the Talmud. He adopts Jewish liturgy. Halal is very close to kosher, and the burial practices are very similar. And there's others more of them. I just list ones that I'm comfortable talking about. And so beginning in 624, he begins to tell the Jews living in the area that if they were not following his religion, they had to leave. In other words, they were being expelled. Now, there are some claims that Mohammed went to Jerusalem, and or even Judea, and there's absolutely no historical evidence that he ever did that. So let's come back to his campaign of conquest. It was not just Mohammed. He had followers who wanted to increase the amount of territory that they controlled. So there were some caliphs who allied themselves with Muhammad, and you can see in the black lines that's where they went. Muhammad's followers went off into the Middle East and into what's now Egypt and the Sinai, up into Turkey, and then ultimately into Persia. And so this was all done in the first half of the 6th century. So after the conquest of Persia, the Muslims began to convert many of the local residents to Islam. And there's nothing wrong with that. The first, what's now known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was built in Jerusalem around 705 AD. Actually, there's been 3 of them built on if I remember correctly, on those grounds. But again, that's the first one. 719 AD is the first mention of Jerusalem in any Islamic literature. And by the way, this is 4,470 years after Judaism began. And then in 800 AD, the Muslim population in Palestine or Judea is now the majority. So that's the first time that happens. And again, it's 4,400 years after Jews were living in the area. So now I talk to probably one of the more interesting interludes, which are the Crusaders. There were 7 of them, 7 crusades. They came in, they conquered the area, what they call the Holy Land. They created the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasted for about 200 years, from 1099 to 1291. They sacked Constantinople, the Ottoman Turks sacked Constantinople, so there's constant wars going on. And ultimately, the Byzantine era folds, or collapses. And the Crusaders did 2 things. One, besides fighting the Muslims, they fought the Jews who were allied with the Muslims, trying to keep the Crusaders from taking over the Holy Land. And then also the Crusaders did what every other conqueror did, as they tried to expel the Jews because they viewed them as Christ killers. So during the Ottoman Empire, which is the longest empire that controlled the area, there was a slow reduction of the Jewish population. You can see here in this chart. You can spend hours studying this. I pulled the information from Wikipedia and the Jewish Virtual Library. I've got a couple other sources. I picked averages of the numbers, so you get a pretty good idea. So what's interesting is that the Jewish population in Palestine began to decline and got down to less than 2,000 people in around the late 1600s. And then it began to increase. And then it began to increase a lot in the late 1800s. And then I'll get into the reason why in a second. But throughout the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans had a love-hate relationship with the Jewish population. Sometimes they killed them, sometimes they expelled them, sometimes they just taxed them. And in the late 1880s, when the Sultan of Hamid II just realizes the Jewish immigration to Palestine or Judea is increasing at a fairly rapid rate, he issues a series of edicts as to limits to who could come. And so what was causing that? And that was this movement called Zionism. And it was nothing more than a movement of Jews living in Central Europe, or actually just say Europe, but primarily Central Europe, who wanted to move back to Palestine, which they considered the traditional homeland. So what happened is that Jews began to buy land in Palestine and then move there. Emphasize the word buy the land, to which they would then get title, and then they'd buy more land. There would be investments. And one of the leaders of this was a guy by the name of Theodor Herzl, who was a Hungarian journalist. And it's what he was really doing is making a case to the European governments, who were not listening, that there was a strong case for a Jewish homeland in what was then now called Palestine or the Holy Land. So the whole Zionist movement and the Zionist Congress was nothing more than a vehicle to exert political pressure. What was interesting was that out of this, one of the offers, the Brits offered, Brits and the French offered Madagascar as a Jewish homeland, not going to take it. Kenya was served up as a place to go, not accepted. And the Jews then decided to turn to the Sultan and say, hey, we will, or I shouldn't say the Jews, the Zionists turned to the Sultan and said, hey, we will pay off your debt, by which time the Ottoman Empire was essentially bankrupt, in debt up to its yin-yang, and could not raise money. And so the Zionists said, hey, we'll pay for all this stuff, just allow an increase in immigration to Palestine. He said no. World War I breaks out. The Ottoman Empire allies itself with Germany for whatever reasons it decided to do so. And all discussion of the Jewish state ends, at least publicly. Immigration to Palestine comes to a screeching halt because Palestine is now occupied by the Turks. And until the Brits freed it, thanks to a guy by the name of Lawrence of Arabia, it's pretty much I'm not going to use the word backwater, but the Brits promised the Arabs that supported Lawrence that they would create independent nations. So then you have in the middle of World War I, the secret treaty called the Sykes-Picot Treaty. It was negotiated by the Brits and the French and the Russians. Now remember that in World War I, the Brits and the French and the Russians were all allied until 1917. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution occurs, or the Russian Revolution occurs, the Bolsheviks take control, they pull Russia out of the war. Well, once the participation of the Russians in the execution or the follow-up to Sykes-Picot becomes moot, and I'll get more to that in a second. So what Sykes-Picot did was it drew lines on a map, and this is a drawing of what those lines are, as to how the British and French were going to draw up or divide up the Ottoman Empire once they won. Now understand this is 1916. The war is still in doubt. The United States is still fighting even the idea of joining the war. And so the Brits and the French are struggling on the Western Front against the Germans. The Germans are beating the crap out of the Russians. The Russian Empire is tottering, and ultimately in 1917 it falls. So what the Brits wanted out of this thing was control of the oil, because already the British companies were finding oil in around the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Gulf, and in parts of Iraq or Mesopotamia. And so that's what the Brits wanted. The French wanted Syria and Lebanon for reasons of their own. And one of the interesting things is the Russians, the Tsar, when his representative said, I want to participate in the managing of Palestine. Why? Well, because that's where he wanted to send his Russian Jews to get rid of them. So in the middle of all this, 1970 comes along, and out of the blue comes the 1917 Balfour Declaration. And in this, what you see on the right-hand side of the slide is the entire letter, all 3 paragraphs of it. And all it says is His Majesty's government favors the creation of a Jewish homeland. Period, end of statement. Okay? That's all it says. What it does not mention is what was agreed to in Sykes-Picot, which the world does not know until the Bolsheviks come to power. And when they finally got control of the government offices, the Bolsheviks find the copies of the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and they give it to The Guardian, which is a newspaper in the UK, who publishes it all. And suddenly Sykes-Picot becomes public. So Sykes-Picot is probably one of the last imperial acts of the Brits and the French in terms of dividing up territory. So the Balfour Declaration sets off, particularly right after World War I, a surge in immigration to Palestine. The Ottoman Empire collapses. Okay, it's divided up pretty much along the lines of Sykes-Picot, and immigration again resumes to Palestine. And you can see I picked 3 dates because it's starting in 1938. It started to tail off dramatically thanks to the fact the Nazis were not allowing Jews to emigrate. And there was also a revolt in 1936 led by the Mufti of Jerusalem, who ultimately becomes an ally of Adolf Hitler and lives in Berlin during World War II. But this is the influx of Jews prior to beginning of World War II. At the end of World War II, you have all these refugees, and again, they want to come to Palestine, which is being run by the Brits. The Brits don't want them to come because the Arab population is resisting, and it's a mess. Ultimately, have the partition of Palestine in 1948. So I'm going to stop here, and I want to give you this and point out a couple things. Is number one, that for 5,784 years, long before Mohammed arrived or died or Islam became a religion, Judaism and Jews were living in this area. Or Jews were practicing Judaism and Jews were living in whether you want to call it the Holy Land, Palestine, Judea, or Palestine. And we've remained there. And despite attempts by 5 different empires and to force them out. So the claim that Israel is on traditional Arab land simply ignores history, and it's simply not true. So I want to step forward and kind of step back from this and go, we have a mess in the Middle East right now. And this is my view of this, is because I do not think that the West can impose peace on the Middle East. I believe a couple of conditions have to be met, and one of which is that the people who are resisting the state of Israel have to say, okay, we recognize the state of Israel's right to exist. We recognize that we were going to stop trying to destroy it. And the country that's providing most of the money right now, Iran, has to stop providing support. And I list the ways, just some of the support. Because right now, Iran provides most of the financial support to Hamas and Hezbollah. And that's not done well for them in the current situation, again, late March 2025. So what has to make this work? One is a recognition that much of Arab society is tribal. That doesn't mean that it can't be democratic. It's just it's a tribal structure. That's how most of the GCC nations, how the Saudi monarchy works. They're monarchies, they're tribal societies, and anything that will succeed in solving this problem has to be with that as an overriding or overarching framework. Now, whatever government that governs the West Bank and Gaza cannot look like a republic or parliamentary democracy unless it meets this tribal construct. And it must be uniquely Arab, which means that the Arab nations have to come up with a solution and then put it in place and then ensure that it continues. Because again, anybody from the West who's either Christian or Jews is going to be rejected. Because we're infidels and we're not going to have credibility. So the Arab world has to fix this problem and the Western world has to support that fixing. And the sovereign funds of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia, have enough money so they can pay for the rebuilding of Gaza, and it wouldn't even meet rounding error. The problem is they don't want to do it because they don't like the Palestinians. But again, this is a problem. I go back to the first slide. This is a problem they created. They need to fix it. So with that, just want to go remind everybody I write books. These are 3 different series. The top series follows a young naval officer from Vietnam to the time he retires. He's a helicopter pilot just like I was, and he has a fair number of interesting adventures. The middle row is the first 5 of will ultimately be an 8-book series that starts during the American Revolution, and it will end around the War of 1812. And the bottom 3 rows, the bottom row is counterterrorism books, which deal with chemical attack, a biological attack, attempt to shut down the air transportation in the U.S., and then also a counterterrorism book in which a Hezbollah terrorist is the subject of a manhunt. So if you enjoyed this thing, I've done other things on foreign policy, I've done things on aviation. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and also buy my books.